I've been told, and I won't call names, that we've put together a panel of troublemakers. So we're expecting some fire from this panel. Really, the purpose of this panel is to get a bit of updates on what this whole global compact on safe migration, safe, regular, orderly migration is all about. What has been happening since the adoption of the New York Declaration last year? What can we expect from this global compact process? And what, according to our panelists, but also according to you, are the most important items and elements that we need to focus on? What can we expect from this global compact? So maybe just a few quick basics for those of you who are not able to follow this on a day-to-day basis, and I'm actually included in that. We've included in your welcome packages an information leaflet from that other GCM, the Global Coalition on Migration, who's put together a very helpful information sheet on what the Global Compact is, how it will be negotiated, what will happen over the next couple of months and years. So just very briefly, the Global Compact on safe migration will be negotiated by governments in a UN-led process. It's led by two co-chairs, two co-facilitators, I should say, the government of Mexico, the government of Switzerland. There are three phases. One is a consultation phase, and we're already a couple of months into that consultation phase, where there's a whole range of thematic meetings and regional consultations and national consultations to get input on what the Global Compact could be. Then there is a stock-taking phase, which will start, I think, somewhere in November. There'll be a big conference in Mexico with governments and civil society, where basically they take stock of everything that came out of these thematic and regional consultations. And then as of February, I believe, there should be a first draft, which for some reason in the UN we call a zero draft, of this Global Compact. And then the real negotiations will start on this document, even though at this stage, we don't know really yet what a global compact really is or look like. So that's one of the answers, one of the things we would like to see answer, and also define what we think it should be. I don't think this panel really needs any introduction. These are three people that have been involved in the world of international migration for a very long time. It's also a panel that's very much in transition. So. Mr. François Crépeau, who's been for the last 6 years the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants, is actually finishing up his mandate tomorrow. So we're very honored that he's here with us on this. But I'm sure we won't lose him for the movement of human rights of migrants, and we're curious to hear about your future plans. Ms. Laura Thompson has been the Deputy Director of IOM for quite some years now, has been very involved in last year's New York Declaration, and will tell us a little bit about what's been happening with the negotiations and the role of IOM with regards to the Global Compact. And then Mr. Gregory Maniatis, who I'm sure all of you are also familiar with, for years was one of the senior advisors of our former Special Representative on Migration, Mr. Peter Sutherland, who unfortunately no longer is in that role, but thankfully left us with a really great report, the Sutherland report, and I'm sure Gregory can say a little bit about that and how that came into being. So I think the first question for our panel would be, and I'd like to start with Ms. Laura Thompson, if that's okay, is why do we need a global compact? What do we need to fix in our world of international conventions and international institutions that a global compact can do? And how does it matter to us as refugees, migrants, families, organizations working on the ground? Laura.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate at this panel. It's really a pleasure for me to be at the Civil Society.
Can you?
No, just closer. Yeah. Lovely.
Like Madonna.
Okay. I have never seen Madonna, but apparently François looks at that very often. Anyway, so it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. And I really wish all of you to have a very interesting civil society forum now. It is indeed a very important moment. Well, first of all, I think, why do we need a global compact? Well, how do we get there? I think it is extremely important. I joined IOM 8 years ago as a Deputy Director General. And at that time, there was a total disagreement among states on how to move forward on the issue of migration. In these 8 years, we have made a lot of progress. This global forum, by the way, has been a lot of help in order to do this progress. And Gregory and Peter Sutherland, with his role, has been also a lot of help in bringing together governments looking at migration in a different way. Migration has become an extremely relevant subject, both at the national level and at the regional level, but also at the global level. And where there was a total disagreement about whether to get a governance framework of migration before, now there is a much higher convergence of the need to really create something. And that's what the Global Compact might be, something. We don't know what exactly at this point. But the hope is that we are going to get basically a set of principles or understandings of how to manage migration in a comprehensive and holistic way. So it doesn't look only at the security and regulation aspects, but also at the development aspects and other things. And it has to include the humanitarian, the human rights, climate change, and other aspects. So it's the first attempt, I would say, from the international community, and the first time that there was the political will to have 193 heads of state that came together last September at the General Assembly and decided to, through this New York Declaration, to try to bring all stakeholders together in order to get the Global Compact. Now, if this happens, it will indeed be the first time and I would say a historic moment where migration is going to be finally guided by international standards, international principles agreed by everybody. And that's the hope. So we need a global compact because certainly migration is one of the most important issues of the 21st century. It's not new, but it has become politically extremely important for everybody. It has to be, and I think there is a clear understanding today that migration cannot be regulated in a bilateral basis among different governments. It has to be in a broader multilateral framework. And I think at this point we have this, indeed, political will. Now, there was a little bit of comments before in the opening ceremony about a certain disparity between what we are seeing at the international level and what we are seeing at the internal level. And I think this is extremely important because indeed there is this convergence of views at the international level to move towards a kind of framework for international governance of migration, and at the same time we are seeing at the national level extremely restrictive tendencies. And these contradictions, I think, need to be resolved. And we will talk about that after. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess that's one of our primary questions also as civil society organizing on the ground is we already have all these principles and commitments and standards, but why are they not being implemented? And is that maybe what the compact will do, bring them together so that we have a framework that we can basically hit governments on the head? François, if we could turn to you to answer that question, but in particular you, in your mandate and in your last 6 years, came out with a report proposing a 2035 agenda for human mobility, proposing a set of human mobility goals. And maybe you can say something about your vision for a global compact and how that can translate to realities on the ground.
Thank you. If success is defined as exceeding one's expectations, the key to success is to have realistic expectations. And so for the Global Compact, we need to think that there will be short-term objectives, mid-term objectives, and long-term objectives. The long-term objectives will not be solved by the Global Compact. there will be other mechanisms after the Global Compact, but the Global Compact can set the stage for that. Undocumented migration. So many factors intervene. Temporary migrant worker precariousness due to sponsorship mechanisms, kafala mechanisms. These will not change very quickly. States will grapple with that. They will grapple with these issues. They have to change economic, political, societal structures, structural features of our societies in order to reduce human rights violations on that front. And that will require the cooperation of many, many actors over many, many years. And implementing fully Target 10.7 of the SDGs, facilitating mobility, will take many years. And so the GCM must set the stage for that. To me, a plan of action is a minimum over a few years. It's a minimum. What I've suggested, as was just said, is a 15-year agenda with goals, targets, and indicators. Might not be for this time, but maybe the GCM could start a process towards long-term planning of mobility and diversity. But in the short term, and that's what the GCM can achieve, and that's why we're all here today, there are many, many things that can be done. The co-facilitators have asked us to bring concrete examples of what works so that we can share that and inspire governments. And I think our role in the next 18 months is inspirational. We have to bring forward what works, what changes are possible. And the good practices are in the hands of many people. Ordinary citizens and civil society, you are working towards that. Migrant communities, diasporas are, very courageously and very imaginatively doing things for themselves, and that is inspirational. Public services, policymakers are here and there creating new ways of thinking mobility, of thinking diversity. Public services, for example, with firewalls, I've talked about that before. Regional free trade zones try to encourage mobility through these regional areas. Cities, subnational states are very innovative in how they try to integrate, to do social integration, not only for migrants, also for the youth, also for the poor, trying to do social integration at human level. Unions are now interested in protecting migrant workers on an equal footing with citizens. The business community knows that mobility and diversity is key to their success, to innovation. And there are many fields in which these innovative practices, these examples of change exist. Schools and universities. Integration to schools and universities, integration in the labor market, implementation of labor standards to all workers, apprenticeship by innovative employers, inclusion of migrant workers in unions, change in the language, working with the media, it was mentioned earlier, but also fight against xenophobia, working with National Human Rights Commission, ombudsperson, lawyers, courts. Access to justice for migrants is a long-term goal, but there are many things we can do very quickly. Alternatives to detention is something that we've talked, and some examples around the world actually do work. And this has to be disseminated. Family reunification. So showing success on mobility and diversity is the only way to convincingly respond to nationalist, populist voices. And so we need to prepare for the long-term, long-haul, generational effort, but we need also to demonstrate success now, to inspire governments to prepare for this long-haul generational change. And that is possible thanks to migrants first, but also thanks to all of us.
Thank you, Mr. Crépeau. Gregory, Maniatis, if we could ask you to elaborate on that, do you agree that will be the focus the coming 18 months, to bring up inspiring practices and practices that work, or maybe practices that don't work that we need to fix? Is that is that the focus to reach the long-term goal? And how does this relate to the proposals that were put forward in the Sutherland report, if you would like to speak to that?
Sure. Thank you, Vies. Thank you to all of you. It's really a pleasure to be here. It reminds me of the early battles to have civil society be part of the Global Forum back in 2007. And I think that the process of Civil Society Days has evolved enormously. It's really on its own inspirational to see how well organized all of this is. And in fact, François mentioned that we have to be inspirational. I'm going to counter with another word, which is you have to be organizational. I mean, you cannot just inspire, you have to organize. The compact, when it was introduced into the report of the special advisor to the previous Secretary General, Ms. Karen Abuzaid, the idea of a global compact on migration was nothing. It was there because there was a global compact on refugees and advocates, actually within governments, who were focused on migration, said, we need to have something comparable. Let's put in a global compact on migration. And that was agreed to by governments, but there was nothing there. And I think that's the starting point for your deliberations, is to remember that there is no one else out there still who knows what the global compact is. This is a process of creation right now. You are just as well positioned as governments, maybe more so, to decide what the global compact is. Don't assume that others are in control. Don't assume that the co-facilitators know more than you do, or even that they have more power than you do over the global compact. So that's, I think, the starting point in terms of your deliberations. I was also thinking, as François was speaking, about the many roles that civil society plays. And often, and I think at the start of the relationship between governments and civil society at the Global Forum, there was a big emphasis about the role of advocacy, right? So the raising the costs to governments of misbehavior, of bad behavior, right? So there's a great importance for civil society to point out the bad behavior of governments, to raise the cost for governments misbehaving. And that's absolutely part of what we should be doing. But there's the other side too, which I think is critically important now in the context of the Global Compact, which is civil society can also reduce the risks to government of doing the right thing. So you can raise the costs of bad behavior, but you can also reduce the risks of doing the right thing. And you do that in the way I think that François mentioned, which is from your experience in the field to help design policies and programs that are better in terms of protecting the rights of migrants and others and host communities. So you have a proactive role to play. And just to give you a sense, and we can continue the conversation, of what one person, my view of what the compact could be, I would break it down into really four goals for the next year and a half. One is to imagine what migration should look like 20 years from now, right? So you need to undertake the exercise of envisioning how you really think people should be moving across borders 20 years from now. Not tomorrow, not in 5 years, but in 20 years. And 20 years is an important time frame because it takes you out of the current politics, right? So if you can imagine your interests and the interests of states 20 years from now, negotiate that compact. Don't negotiate today's compact. But you have to be able to imagine that system. The second goal, I think, which is much more easily attainable, is to think about the specific ways in which movement across borders can be better over the next 5 years, right? And the Sutherland report, which you mentioned very generously, gives many recommendations in that respect. And I would urge you, as I've urged governments and others as well, to look at those recommendations, but also to imagine other ones. François mentioned a few that are not in that report, operational improvements to how we move across borders, civil society should take responsibility for leading on several of those. You should be the ones who are identified with leadership, whether it's improving consular protection or addressing the costs of recruitment or figuring out this very thorny question of the space between economic migrants and refugees. Take leadership over the next months, not 18 months, over the next few months, and bring that to governments and think about that in a cooperative way, not necessarily only in an adversarial way. The third goal of the compact is to try to take those kinds of commitments when it comes to recruitment or consular protection or children in detention to a higher level. The compact is not going to be a normative, it's not going to be hard law, but there could be elements of it, 1 or 2 or 3, where you develop what we've been calling voluntary binding agreements. So figure out 1 or 2 issues where you might actually be able to get governments, not 193, but maybe 15 or 30 or 50, to sign on to a binding agreement. Again, you might not get all the way there by 2018. We might not get to a signed agreement, but we could get to a commitment to signing an agreement on 2 or 3 issues. And finally, use this moment to build civil society. I think last year was the year of refugees at the UN Summit. As much as it was about both, in terms of broader social awareness of issues, 2016 and the summit at the UN, I think, created, and obviously the events around what was happening with Syria, created broad social awareness of the refugee issue and brought in many new stakeholders, foundations, the private sector, non-traditional actors in that space. I think that the GCM and the international conference that will take place in 2018 can be that same kind of catalytic moment for the migration movement, the beginning of a broadening of stakeholders in that movement that will take us through the next 20 years.
Thank you, Gregory. We're going to take one other quick round of the panelists, and then we're going to open up to the floor. So be prepared to have some questions or have some remarks. We're obviously going to keep it a bit short because we're behind schedule, but so you know. Yeah, so following up on what several of you said, you referred to last year being the year of refugees, and François, you've called your proposal the goals for human mobility, which obviously is broader than, or at least would include refugees. I was just wondering whether you could say something about the linkages you see or not see between the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Migration. And I think another question to that is, which will probably be hard to answer at this stage, but what does it mean for your respective institutions that these global compacts are being developed? So what will be the future role of IOM in migration governance, linking it to refugees? What will be the mandate of your successor? So François, we can start with you, and then Laura.
My successor will define his mandate all by himself. Can't tell him what to do. Links between the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Migration. I'm not sure that in the 18 months we'll achieve many links, but I would like to suggest that the medium-term perspective is about, and I'm a broken record, I repeat myself, is about facilitating the mobility of migrants and of refugees. When people are stuck, they find ways to go where they need to go. If you offer them mobility solutions, they will take them. So, to me, both compacts need to facilitate the mobility of people in need of moving, be they refugees, be they migrants. That means offering mobility solutions. For example, for refugees, we certainly need to work at offering a lot more re-establishment places. We need to offer places in Europe, in North America, in Australia. And initiatives have been taken. Europe is moving very slowly, but is moving towards a better common agenda on receiving refugees. Canada has shown the way with private sponsorship, which I think is a good idea because it creates a constituency of citizens who are actually in favor of more refugees. Australia has taken many refugees. I mean, there are examples out there of how it could work. Certainly, when refugees are offered nothing, well, other people will offer them solutions. Those are the smugglers. Smuggling is an opportunistic industry. And if no official solutions, no facilitated migration mobility solutions are offered by states, they will find their ways. Like many of our ancestors have found their ways. And to me, this is key. For migrants as for refugees, the more we offer mobility solutions to people in need of moving, the more we are going to legalize, regulate, tax mobility, the more migrants and refugees will be protected, but also will use what they are offered. And to me, that's the way of the future. Will that be achieved in the next 18 months? Probably not. And the links between the refugee compact and the migration compact might not be evident in 18 months. But I think that's where we're going. For a very long time, refugees did not ask for refugee status. They could just move along migration lines. Until the 70s, many people who entered Europe would have been defined as refugees under refugee law, but never asked for it because they could get a visa, they could get a resident permit, they could get a work permit. They did not need to ask for refugee status. Only when we started blocking passageways were people asking for refugee status because there was no other way of doing it. To me, this is key. Facilitating mobility, controlling mobility, regulating mobility, but making it easier is key in both cases. As long as we don't realize that, and as long as we don't work towards that, we're going to be stuck in our present ruts.
Thanks. Ms. Thompson?
Yeah, let me just go one thing back, because I fully agree with what Gregory was saying about your role into all this, but I think there is one more thing that is extremely important that you all do, and is part of the problem that governments have today is the negative perception about migration and how it is difficult to convince the people that vote for them that open migratory policies are the way to go. And as a reaction to that, a lot of the governments are taking measures, restrictive measures about migration, because they feel that the general public don't want open migration movements. And I think the role of civil society there is fundamental. You are the ones that can convince your other co-nationals that migration is and can be a positive element into the societies. But that has to be done extremely urgently, because as long as we continue to have an extremely negative perception about migration, it is difficult for governments that want to be re-elected 3 or 2 or 5 years after to take positive measures about opening channels of migration. And I think that is extremely fundamental. Now, with regard to your question, migrants and refugees. Well, there are people that are clearly refugees, and there are people that are clearly migrants. But there are also gray zones in between, and those are the very difficult ones. François was talking about opening regular channels for refugees. The same applies for migrants. Obviously, if you have regular channels for migrating from one place to the other, that limits the possibility of a big industry that is called smuggling of people that is generated only because there are limited channels of regular migration, and because people still will continue moving. When we talk about the drivers of migration, we give a long explanation about why people leave from one place. But very, very few people talk about why people go somewhere else and to one specific place. And it's because there are also pull factors in a series of places. People come to Germany because there is an economy that is working well, because there are jobs, because, as the ambassador said this morning, Germany needs migrants because of demographics and other things. So there are the pull factors. The people come to Germany more than they go to Spain, where there is an economic crisis and there are less jobs, or they go to Greece, where there is a serious economic crisis and there are much less jobs. So the pull factors are extremely important. Now, how do we bring these differences between the migrants and the refugees? And I think it is extremely important to realize that the level of protection that refugees have is, despite the fact that is still we need to do more, is so high compared to an irregular migrant that what has happened lately is that in a certain way people are forced to ask for asylum to have a period of time when they are considering, when the government are considering whether or not they are going to give them asylum in order to remain in the country and try to find additional solutions. So we have created, with this extreme difference of protection between the two categories, we have created certainly, we have in a certain way forced people to ask for asylum even if they don't have an asylum claim. So I think that has created certainly a backlog in the asylum resolution and have made governments to even become more reluctant to asylum. So it is indeed a very complex process. Now, you ask also about the role of our different organizations, and certainly I represent one that is the biggest organization that within the UN system that is dealing with migration, and that is dealing with migration in a comprehensive way. Well, a lot would have to be depending on what the Global Compact is going to be at the end. We were talking about the possibilities of getting binding commitments, some binding commitments. I think we certainly don't have to start from scratch. François can tell you perfectly well what the legal obligations of governments are today with regard to human rights, with regard to labor rights. So there are a set of standards that are compulsory for states that exist today and that they have to be the basis of the Global Compact. There are other things that can be achieved and that we are hoping that they be achieved. But behind all that, and depending on the level of compulsory elements that the Global Compact will have, or the follow-up mechanisms that are created with the Global Compact, then there will have to be institutions that will have a role to do that follow-up. And that's where eventually, you know, the International Organization for Migration could have that role. It could be a broader UN, set of organizations that have each one different roles. But certainly, at some point, a certain type of mechanism, and you were talking about mechanism, we use that when we don't want to say anything concrete, but a mechanism should be created in order to follow up whatever agreements and eventually obligations we can achieve with the Global Compact.
Thank you. Gregory?
So the UN summit last year, it's hard to remember this, was titled the UN Summit on the Large-Scale Movements of Migrants and Refugees. And unfortunately, it really wasn't about that. I mean, there's some good aspects to the fact that we changed. I mean, with the summit and the New York Declaration, we've covered pretty much everything that we could cover with respect to refugees and migration. There's 20 to 23 pages of commitments to do all the right things with respect to both. But when you do so much, you end up doing really next to nothing because there's no priorities. And this is a world of extremely limited resources. The limited resources affect you, limited resources affect governments. And so you have to make priorities. And I would argue that we should go back again to this question of large-scale movements of migrants and refugees and think really hard about making that a priority for the work that's going to be done over the next 18 months. And one reason to do that is because what we've seen over the past year or two is the separation of the refugee advocacy and the migration advocacy communities. And I, just to be a little bit of a troublemaker, I will lay the responsibility for that perhaps more on the side of the refugee advocates. There is this sense that refugees are more sympathetic. Obviously, there is hard law that backs up the protection regime. But more importantly, I think there is the sense that these images that were coming out of the Mediterranean over the past couple of years really reinforced public support for refugees. And frankly, migrants were muddying the waters for those who were advancing the refugee cause. And that was very dangerous because, quite honestly, if you combine the forces on the refugee and the migration advocacy side, even combined, they are a small fraction of the power against mobility and against migration. So I think one goal should be to try to stitch those two communities back together again, one goal that you should have, and one way to do that is to define a common agenda. What is the common agenda between the Global Compact on refugees and the Global Compact on migration? Really work hard these days to define that, and then make sure you reach out to, the UNHCR plays a really big role. They should be part of this conversation these 3 days. Refugee advocates should be deeply part of these conversations on the migration side. We can go into, during the discussion, where the common points are, but I think that should be a priority for the GFMD.
Well, that's, I think, a great way to open up the discussion, this question of linking the refugee community with the migration community and where that has and has not happened. I know there are quite some agencies in the room that work on both issues and that tried to do this connection last year to a greater or lesser extent. So I'd like to open up the floor for any questions or remarks. But before I do that, can I ask one special guest that we have in the audience to say a few words about civil society's engagement in the whole process of the consultation process towards the Global Compact. We have with us one great former chair on whose shoulders I stand. It's Mr. Colin Raja, who's now facilitating civil society's inclusion in the thematic debate. So Colin, if you could maybe say a few words on that, and then we open up the floor.
Thank you, Wies. Thank you, Wies Maas, everybody. She can't get away from us. We keep pulling her back. Very great to have you back, Wies. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I wanted to say that it's really, again, to complement everything all the panelists say, I think it's really particularly important for us to really recognize this moment we're in. Some of us remember the 2006 first high-level dialogue, the 2007 first GFMD. A few of us were there. It wasn't until 2008 GFMD when we had a mass mobilization from around the world around the GFMD. We don't have that kind of luxury this year. We had 9 months in this consultation phase to help set the tone. That 9 months now is about 5 or 6 months left of that. We will have another 9 more months to help define the actual language and help support the government's negotiating that. But this time to set the tone of that compact, exactly in terms of many things that the panelists have mentioned, the opportunities we have before us is really important. We are perhaps looking at the most significant development on the global migration framework that many of us might ever see in our lifetime. So it's really important that we remain engaged and very, very focused on the mechanisms on how we can achieve something that works. So just to set the timeline on where we are right now, A number of things have already happened. The Child Rights Initiative, for example, is a very, very good initiative, has come up with very strong recommendations on that particular issue for the Global Compact. We have this next 2 days of the Civil Society Days packed with workshops, breakout sessions, special sessions that are focused on achieving some really concrete recommendations on the Global Compact from us. 2.5 weeks from now, on July 17th, we will have the first opportunity for a global civil society consultation. Consultation might be a little bit of a heavy word that we're using, but it's a way to kind of gather where we are right now, to kind of launch into a whole series of regional consultations in August and September that many of you are leading. We want to underline this fact again, that many thanks, of course, to Deputy Director General and IOM for supporting this, and my role for facilitating that. But it's really important that all of these regional consultations are led by you and your networks, regional civil society networks that have played such an important role in our convening today and the last 10 years here, but also kind of taking it forward into the Global Compact process. They will be organizing the 6 or 7 regional civil society consultations in August, September, leading into October. And in November, we'll be kind of consolidating our reports from those. And in December, we will be coming to Mexico and trying to convene ourselves into a global stock-taking meeting for civil society preceding the government stock-taking meeting. So that's the timeline and what we're trying to do. But going back to the modalities resolution, it's really clear that there are certain things that the UN has also said about in terms of how it wants to see stakeholders participate and engage in the Global Compact process. Some of you might have read this in the modalities resolution. Many of you have started to experience it when you apply to participate in the many different things, the special accreditation process and all that. It is very challenging. We completely understand that. So let's take up that challenge and do what we can with it. One of the ways to do that is in the thematic sessions. There are 6 thematic sessions that are laid out for the consultation phase, 3 of which have just passed. So we're kind of in the halfway point of that. Stakeholders can participate in that through the accreditation process with your ACOSOC status and all of that. It's a very detailed process. It is very limited. It is extremely limited. The co-facilitators have recognized the limitation. They have opened up on the second day of each thematic session a special morning session for 15 minutes for stakeholders to speak, just openly for stakeholders only to speak, and invited governments to participate in that. So we want to try and engage with that as much as we can, but we understand it's extremely challenging and very, very limited. And this is very true for all of the world. In any issue that we're looking at, the space for civil society is shrinking. So given those challenges, we're moving forward with that. We also have a stakeholder hearing that will be taking place preceding the 4th thematic session coming up. So July 24th, 25th will be the 4th thematic session in New York. July 26th will be the first stakeholder hearing. Here's an opportunity where we will be able to speak. And the speakers will be selected by a steering committee of stakeholders. Many of you in the room are part of that steering committee. So we will have an opportunity to define who speaks and speaks on what. And many of us will hopefully have that opportunity to speak and bring forward these recommendations that we are percolating and developing from here today and onwards. So these are the many different opportunities we'll have within the UN system, but also Modalities Resolution Article number 7 really refers to the opportunities we have beyond that, looking for spaces at the regional, national, as well as the global levels for where we can engage as stakeholders for civil society alongside other stakeholders, academia, the private sector, NHRIs, national human rights institutions, and others. So I ask us for you to look at this opportunity that we have before us and grab onto it, really understand where these opportunities are, and take up the challenges as well. And also, we'll try and lay out an invitation and an agenda, provisional agenda for the July 17th Global Civil Society Consultation. I think there's a space outside. We try to put this up for people to get more information about that. But this will be the first step into this processes that we come out of the Civil Society Days for. So hopefully that gives a very quick picture, Luis, that you asked for, to kind of lay out where we have the opportunities for us to engage, and hopefully we take up the challenge and come up with some strong recommendations in terms of mechanisms that we can bring forward through this engagement.
Thank you very much, Colin. And both of us are not able to get away from this organizing space, and it's a pleasure to be in here together. So let's take about 3-4 points from the floor. We'll start in the back, the gentleman with the white shirt. Yes.
Bien, buenos días.
Good morning, thank you very much. My name is Edgardo Chavez from Honduras. We would like to retake the good intentions in the framework of this compact, but we are concerned about the regressive policies that our governments are promoting. Governments are promoting this global pact while they have regressive policies towards migrants. How can we incorporate some indicators or a framework in order to respect the human rights of migrants within this global compact?
Could we take here at the front, Vikash?
Thank you very much. I have a point to Ms. Laura Thompson. You pointing at the civil society organizations that it is the duty that our civil society can play a role to convince people that migration has also a positive aspect. But I think the government has the equal role to play, and it is the government. Government has to take proactive engagement to dispel negative narratives on migration and migrants. And second thing is that there has to be an end of using migrants as political and electoral tools. And finally, I think governments have to follow a non-discriminatory policy and practices in regard to migration. Thank you.
Thank you. Right here in the middle with the white shirt. Yeah.
Thank you. Carolina Jimenez from Amnesty International based in Mexico. A question for you, Gregory. Ambassador Thompson made a very good point about how toxic, migration has become for electoral politics, I should say. Yet you mentioned that if we want to negotiate a good, global compact, we should think of migration in 20 years. We should think of future scenarios and negotiate that. Yet when we sit at the table with policymakers, they're not thinking about the next 20 years. They're thinking about their current electoral context, and those concerns are always there. So if you could elaborate a bit more on how you view that proactive role that you clearly stated we should be playing, and that we are playing in a very, very difficult context, that would be great. Thanks.
Let's go to that side of the room. Yeah, you with the green shirt. Behind Dennis. Sorry, Dennis.
Okay, thanks, and for the speakers and for the chair. I think that in order to negotiate strong GCM, we have to differentiate between the implications and the kind of this GCM. We should concentrate on what kind of instrument we are going to. Are we going to a binding instrument before talking about what we have in this GCM? Because listening to the three speakers, I heard words like inspiration or imaginary or principles. So I don't think this fulfill the ambitions of many of those who are defending migrant workers' rights. So are we thinking about a binding instrument, or are we thinking just about general principles, about maybe a new Bible or what? Thank you.
Okay, so we'll take two more questions and then we'll turn back to the panel. Sorry, I should talk to the microphone. We'll take 2 more questions, then we'll turn back to the panel to do some answers and also some wrap-up remarks. Because I see that the new special representative on international migration has joined us, Ms. Louise Arbour, so we have to move on to the next panel. So let's take the lady here in front in yellow.
Thank you. My name is Irene Hocha-Poda, coming from Vienna. I would like to say that there is a problem. We are speaking about a global compact, but our Ministry of Foreign Affairs recently said that there is the development cooperation will be coupled to the to reduce the migration. So there is a problem. If we are, as a society, civil society, we are trying to make, to give the migration as a positive thing for the society, for the Austrian society, the European society, and also for the African and the other society. There are governments who are trying to stop the migration. So I think this is, there is a problem here we have to talk about.
Thank you. So I'm very sorry. We will have more time for interaction also in the next panel. So the last question will be from Vincent, our outreach rapporteur.
Thank you. A question coming from our friends and colleagues from Budapest who are looking at us directly on live. So hello, my friends in Budapest. And we were talking about shrinking space. We know that in Hungary we had a law just voted very recently, a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago exactly, demonizing civil society, especially on the question of migration. So their questions of our friends and colleagues there from Budapest is: remittances change the landscape on how migration is understood prior to the migration crisis. How can we reframe migration today in a positive sense again? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank all of you. So we'll turn back to the panel now to take up a couple of these questions somewhere along similar lines, and maybe have a few concluding remarks, if you could, with some advice for us, civil society, going forward in the next 2 days. So, Mr. Crépeau, can we start with you?
Many interesting questions. Role of civil society in the toxic political debate. For marginalized groups in our societies, the only thing that has ever worked in order to have their rights protected is for them to wrestle their rights from the hands of the powers that be. That's what women have done, that's what the LGBTIQ community has done, that's what First Nations, indigenous peoples in my country have done. They have done so on the basis of asking for equal citizenship. And they've won many battles, although there's many battles still to come. This is not going to happen for migrants. They cannot claim equal citizenship. So it is the responsibility of other people to carry their voice. And that's what civil society is doing. That's what courts are doing. We've had very good court decisions in many countries protecting migrants despite opposition by the government. That's what unions can do when they consider migrants as members and not as competition for their members. That's what the business community can do if they voice their need for mobility and diversity. Many voices in society can carry that. I'll give an example from my country. The private sponsorship mechanism for refugees. Very good, we have taken 37,000 Syrians. That's the very good result, and that's the main result. But next to it, just behind it, the second most important result of that is that it has created a constituency of several hundred thousands of Canadians who are ready to sponsor more refugees. That changes the tone of the conversation. If anyone says, we don't want refugees in Canada, you have hundreds of thousands of Canadians who will say, well, maybe not you, but we want more refugees in Canada. And creating that constituency based on the work of civil society, lawyers, national human rights commissions, courts, but most importantly, citizens, ordinary citizens who in Germany, for example, have done the right thing when Syrians came, trying to organize this voice of migrants, this community of people ready to carry the voice of migrant, to me is key. And mobilizing the citizenry is very important, and allowing that voice to emerge. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to be very difficult because as long as people don't speak up, let's think about women, men have stereotypes, fantasies about what women could do. This has changed. We have in our societies many stereotypes, many fantasies about the danger, the threats of migrants, and we'll have to fight that very often without the precise voice that could fight them the best. So that's our responsibility, and we have to help politicians be able to find the discourse that will convince the constituency that they want to win for the next election. They have to find the proper discourse to convince them that mobility and diversity are actually good things. And this is our responsibility. It's my responsibility as academic, as special rapporteur. It's our responsibility as civil society to try to give them the words, the arguments, the examples that they can present in order to make those nationalist populist voices back off.
Thank you.
Well, certainly I would agree with you that governments have a very important role. But again, I think if you were in the other building, I would be talking to the government. Here we're talking about your role in this. And I think it is fundamental. And François very clearly explained what specifically can you do. But I think as long as we continue having an extremely negative perception about migration, the politicians will always have problems in trying to move forward towards open discourses about positive and open flows of migration. So this is, for me, the first element that we need to tackle. It doesn't matter if we get a binding or a non-binding instrument. What we need to is to really change the perception about migration. And the moment that we will do that, a lot of other things will come easier. As long as we don't do that, probably nothing will really move forward. The objective is not to reduce migration, and I think that should be very clear to everybody. But the Global Compact is not being negotiated to reduce migration. The Global Compact is being negotiated to try to find orderly, safe ways of migrating. And certainly what we want is all, I think, is to try to find arguments to show the importance of those regular ways of migrating. In reality, what we want to try to reduce is unsafe and irregular migration. That is dangerous for everybody, particularly for the migrants. And that creates a lot of abuse and exploitation of people. So reducing irregular migration, yes. Reducing migration, no. It's the other way around, I would say. Binding or not binding instrument? Well, honestly, in an ideal world, we should go for a convention on migration and get everything recorded there, but we are not there. And if we try to get there tomorrow, we are going to fail. So we have to be realistic about what can be achieved in this process. And I think Gregory very realistically said, we have to imagine what do we want in 20 years, and now he will explain to you how, because I will leave that to him. But where do we want to be in 20 years, and where do we want to be in 10 years, and in 5 years, and where do we want to be tomorrow? And if we manage to identify those different things, then we can identify also a set of convergences that exists today. And we were talking, and François talked about, for example, detention centers. This is an issue where there is divergence. Governments don't agree. Some governments see detention as the only measure. Others are looking at it at alternatives, ways to it, and others don't use detention at all. Well, we probably, if we try to put a rule that nobody can do detention anymore of migrants, we probably will fail. But what we can do eventually is to find out what are the standards for detention, at least. That we say, okay, we are going to have some humane standards that are agreed by everybody. So the end goal on the 20 years might be no detention. But in the next 5 years, we have to create all those standards so that people that are in detention have at least humane and dignified conditions. So that's I think, the logic of low-hanging fruits, mid-term goals, and long-term goals that can come together. And to conclude, I need to respond this in Spanish.
How can we incorporate the respect of human rights in the Global Compact? Well, we have a great amount of standards and regulations in terms of human rights that are of compulsory implementation for everyone, and that's a reality. My colleague here to my left is an example of this issue. We do not need any more standards. What we need is a good implementation of these standards. And what we can do, thanks to this Global Compact, is sharing these good practices that exist all over the world. All of you here, in most of your organizations, are working in order to protect and respect human rights. All of you do advocacy work with governments in order to improve the respect of human rights. And among all of us, we can share the good practices about how we can really implement these existing standards all over the world, including migrants. I think that this is the work that we all can do in this consultation and negotiation process for the Global Compact, and this needs to be part of the implementable part of the Global Compact in the future. Thank you very much.
Actually, Laura, you did a pretty good job of describing what the 20-year horizon could look like. So, Carolina, thank you for that question. It's a really important one. And as Laura said, I think it's critical to be able to know where you're going, right? So we have this problem in migration sometimes and in policy where we're sprinting from event to event, right? So we're sprinting from the summit now to the Global Compacts. And you kind of breathlessly want to get everything in. So the Global Compact, for me, has to be different than the New York Declaration, right? The New York Declaration, everyone put every issue into that declaration. And in the end, if you do that, you don't really think through how you get to where you say you want to go. And so by trying to paint that horizon 20 years out, you can do for a whole series of issues. If you know the system that you want to get to, if you know the world that you want to get to, you can then work backwards and think to yourself, okay, today, what are the things that we can do over the next 5 years that increase the odds that with respect to detention or recruitment or a whole series of other issues, that increase the odds of us being able to get to that point 20 years from now where we have a system that works the way we want it to. You're not going to be able to design it perfectly, but you'll increase the possibilities of getting there. And so thinking 20 years out also does something else. It makes you realize that one of the really important goals for next year is to make sure that everyone is on board, states and other stakeholders, with the idea that the Global Compact is the beginning, right? We had a beginning with the 2030 Agenda that gave us a very broad set of goals. This is another beginning down a process where states have now committed to working together, right? And so we have to be able to regulate the action a little bit. We have to be able to say, well, we're going to meet in 2018, but we're going to meet again in 5 years. And we're going to take stock of where we are. And then we're going to meet again in 3 or 4 years. And maybe increase the frequency of meetings and pressure on governments. I think if you look 20 years out, you can also begin to answer the question about binding or not binding. As I said earlier, no one really knows except for Louise, who's going to tell us everything about what the compact is. No one really knows what the compact is, right? So it doesn't have to be this or that. We kind of got to the principles last year, right? We've done that for the most part. There's things to restate. There's, I think, new ways of thinking about migration that we could capture in prefatory language, but the compact should really point us in practical ways forward. And as I said earlier, some of those ways can be binding, maybe just a couple. I think it's really important to think hard about what could be binding about the compact. Not the whole thing, obviously, it's not a new convention. It could just be 1 or 2 things on detention, for instance. It's important because you have to establish habits and expectations. So when we started the Global Forum in 2006, we wanted to establish the habit of cooperation amongst states in particular, and then between states and civil society. It didn't exist in 2006. The conversation was very political. The goal of the Global Forum was to normalize the conversation amongst senior policymakers and civil society to talk in more practical terms about migration. We got that done, right? Now we have to take the next step, which is we have to establish the habit of actually committing. And we have to do that step by step. And I don't think, just to close, that the fact that national politics are so toxic makes it impossible to do that. And I'll tell you one reason why, because in that general climate of toxicity at the national level, there are still individuals and governments who want to do the right thing. And if you can figure out what it is that collectively they can do with other states and with other stakeholders, they will fight for it. So I do think you have champions at the national level who are willing to be part of this exercise in really positive and practical ways. So I would take advantage of that.
Thank you. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for getting our thinking starting on this compact. There's a remarkable consensus between our troublemakers, and I think we have an assignment to organize, mobilize, inspire, to get our thinking together fast, because there is an opportunity, because governments don't know yet either what the compact will be. And we need to start thinking gradually. What's now, what's in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, if that's what you also agree on. So that brings us to the end of this panel. Thank you very much again. And I invite